Trump and Iran prophecies rarely begin with missiles or headlines. They begin with quiet warnings that almost no one takes seriously at the time. Long before tension with Iran dominated news cycles, several forecasters, psychics, and political futurists spoke about a confrontation tied not to ideology, but to personality. They described a leader who would not follow diplomatic tradition, who would treat threats as challenges, and who would force long-standing conflicts into the open rather than manage them quietly behind closed doors. Trump and Iran predictions gained little attention when they first appeared. They were scattered across talk shows, obscure interviews, and books that few outside dedicated audiences ever read. The language was vague but consistent. A powerful Middle Eastern state. A Western leader driven by instinct rather than consensus. A confrontation triggered not by accident, but by deliberate pressure. At the time, the idea felt distant, almost theatrical. Iran was contained. Diplomacy still existed. And Donald Trump was not yet president. Trump and Iran tensions matter because they sit at the crossroads of global power, ideology, energy markets, and military escalation. A single miscalculation between Washington and Tehran has the potential to reshape alliances, collapse economies, and ignite conflicts far beyond the Middle East. Unlike past standoffs, this one carried an additional variable: unpredictability at the top. The stakes were not just geopolitical, they were personal. Trump and Iran conflict became inevitable the moment Trump entered office with a worldview that rejected gradualism. Where previous administrations favored long negotiations, Trump favored leverage. Where others used alliances as buffers, he used them as tools. This mattered deeply in the Iranian context, where symbolic strength and perceived weakness are inseparable from political survival. Any signal sent from Washington would be magnified in Tehran. Trump and Iran prophecy narratives often focused on timing rather than detail. Several forecasters spoke about a moment when restraint would vanish, replaced by a sharp demonstration of power meant to reassert dominance. They did not describe a full-scale war. Instead, they described a calculated strike, a move designed to send a message rather than occupy territory. This distinction is critical because it mirrors how modern conflicts are waged in an era where optics matter as much as outcomes. Trump and Iran warnings also emphasized misinterpretation. Iran, they suggested, would read Trump's unpredictability as recklessness. Trump, in turn, would interpret Iranian restraint as weakness. Between those perceptions sat advisors, generals, and intelligence agencies trying to control a narrative that refused to stay controlled. This was not the Cold War, where red lines were carefully defined. This was something far messier. Trump and Iran escalation fears intensified as Trump dismantled existing agreements. The withdrawal from the nuclear deal was not just a policy shift, it was a signal that the rules had changed. For Iran, it confirmed long-held suspicions about American reliability. For Trump, it was proof that pressure could reset negotiations entirely. For observers who remembered the earlier predictions, it felt like the first domino falling into place. Trump and Iran confrontation scenarios described by futurists shared a common element: speed. They warned that when the moment arrived, events would move faster than institutions could respond. There would be little time for mediation, little space for back-channel diplomacy. The situation would unfold in days, not months. This aligns with Trump's governing style, which favored decisive action and public messaging over prolonged deliberation. Trump and Iran's strategic tension was never just about nuclear capabilities. It was about credibility. Iran's leadership had to appear unyielding to domestic audiences. Trump had to appear dominant to his political base. Any compromise risked being framed as surrender. This dynamic created a narrow corridor where only forceful gestures seemed viable. Predictions did not describe chaos for its own sake. They described inevitability driven by psychology. Trump and Iran prophetic themes also touched on isolation. They suggested that when the confrontation peaked, traditional allies would hesitate. Some would distance themselves. Others would issue statements without commitment. The burden of decision would fall squarely on Washington, with Trump standing at the center, absorbing both praise and blame. This too reflected reality. The more Trump challenged alliances, the more alone he became in moments of crisis. Trump and Iran future warnings were not framed as destiny. They were framed as consequence. According to those who made them, the clash would not happen because it was foretold, but because the conditions made alternatives unlikely. Pride, perception, and pressure formed a closed loop. Once inside it, leaders could not easily step out without appearing weak. Trump and Iran storylines reached a turning point when real-world events began matching earlier descriptions. Naval encounters, sanctions tightening, rhetoric sharpening. Each move seemed to echo phrases spoken years earlier, phrases that once sounded abstract but now felt uncomfortably specific. Skeptics dismissed this as coincidence. Believers saw validation. The truth likely sat somewhere in between. Trump and Iran predictions force a larger question about power and foresight. Are such warnings meaningful because they predict events, or because they identify patterns of human behavior that repeat under pressure? When a leader values dominance over consensus, and an adversary values resistance over compromise, conflict does not require prophecy. It requires time. Trump and Iran narrative is not finished in this block. What matters here is the setup, the players, the mindset, the warnings that existed long before headlines caught up. Because in the next phase of this story, theory gives way to action, and the moment that many predictions hinted at begins to take a concrete form that no longer feels symbolic. Attention. This video isn't free. It costs a subscription, a like, and one thoughtful comment. These stories take time to research, connect, and tell the right way. If you value deep history, hidden patterns, and moments that change the world, subscribing helps keep this channel alive. One click supports future investigations, sharper stories, and the next chapter waiting for you. Trump and Iran prophecies took a darker tone when events began to move from rhetoric to action. What had once sounded like vague warnings suddenly started aligning with real-world decisions, real timelines, and real consequences. This was the moment where prediction and policy appeared to collide. By the late 2010s, tensions between the United States and Iran were no longer abstract. They were measurable. Sanctions tightened, naval encounters multiplied, cyber operations intensified behind closed doors, and at the center of it all stood Donald Trump, a president unlike any before him. Transactional, unpredictable, publicly dismissive of traditional diplomacy, yet obsessed with leverage. This was where many revisited the old prophecies. Years earlier, several psychic and futurist figures had described a scenario involving a U.S. leader who would abandon long-standing agreements and replace them with pressure so extreme it risked open conflict. They spoke of Iran not as a sudden battlefield, but as a slow-burning fuse. A nation pushed, isolated, humiliated, but not broken. A nation that would respond asymmetrically, indirectly, and patiently. At the time, those words sounded generic, almost interchangeable with any Middle Eastern forecast. Then Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. The decision shocked allies, delighted hardliners, and destabilized a fragile equilibrium that had taken years to construct. Sanctions returned with unprecedented force. Iran's economy contracted, its currency collapsed. And yet, rather than capitulating, Tehran doubled down. This was the pivot point many prophecy analysts pointed to. According to several earlier predictions, the danger was never a formal declaration of war. It was miscalculation, a chain reaction, a moment where pressure met pride, and neither side could step back without losing face. One prophecy described it as a confrontation that would not begin with an invasion, but with an incident. Another warned of fire without warning, followed by confusion rather than victory. Those words resurfaced after January 2020. The killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was not just a military strike. It was a psychological earthquake. Never before had the United States openly targeted such a high-ranking Iranian figure. The message was unmistakable. No one was untouchable. Supporters called it decisive. Critics called it reckless. Prophecy watchers called it familiar. One archived prediction spoke of a powerful man removed suddenly, causing a nation to hold its breath. Another mentioned celebration in one country, mourning in another, and fear everywhere else. These statements, once ignored, began circulating widely across forums, documentaries, and late-night broadcasts. But the most unsettling part wasn't the accuracy of any single detail, it was the pattern. The prophecies didn't portray Trump as a warmonger in the traditional sense. Instead, they framed him as an accelerant, someone who would intensify existing conflicts rather than start new ones, someone whose strength would lie in escalation, not resolution. And that was exactly what the Iran situation became. Missile strikes followed, then restraint, then silence, then more sanctions. Each move calibrated to avoid all-out war while maintaining constant tension. It was a strategy that confused both allies and adversaries. Was this restraint or preparation? This uncertainty was another recurring theme in the predictions. Several described a leader who would keep opponents guessing, who would blur the line between bluff and intent. One line, often quoted, stated, "His enemies will not know if he is joking, lying, or deadly serious, until it is too late." Iran responded in kind, through proxies, through cyber attacks, through calibrated provocations that stopped just short of forcing a direct response. The Middle East became a chessboard where no one wanted to flip the table, but everyone kept reaching for the edge. And throughout it all, Trump spoke directly to the public. Threats were issued via social media, warnings delivered without diplomatic language, promises of fire like the world has never seen existed alongside claims that he wanted no war at all. To supporters, this was strength. To critics, chaos. To prophecy analysts, it was the embodiment of what had been foretold. But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. One lesser-known prediction didn't focus on war at all. It focused on restraint, specifically a moment where conflict seemed inevitable, but stopped at the last second. According to this vision, the real consequence wouldn't be destruction, but normalization of brinkmanship, a future where standing on the edge became policy. Look closely. And that's exactly what happened. No war was declared. No invasion followed. Yet the relationship between the US and Iran entered a new phase, one defined by permanent hostility without resolution. A frozen conflict punctuated by spikes of fear. This raises a question that still divides analysts today. Were these prophecies describing the future, or were they describing the psychology of power? Trump's approach to Iran revealed something deeper than policy. It exposed how modern conflicts are fought less through armies and more through perception, pressure, and unpredictability. The danger wasn't in a single missile strike. It was in normalization of crisis, and that may have been the real warning all along. As this block ends, one thing becomes clear. The prophecies were never about Iran alone. They were about what happens when volatile leadership meets historical resentment, and when decisions are made not to resolve tension, but to manage it indefinitely. The story doesn't end here. In fact, the most consequential part comes next, after the headlines fade, after the speeches stop, and after the world assumes the danger has passed. Because according to the predictions, that assumption is exactly when the next phase begins. Trump and Iran prophecies didn't end with missiles, sanctions, or televised threats. According to those predictions, the real impact was delayed. Quiet, structural, something that wouldn't look dramatic in the moment, but would reshape behavior long after the headlines disappeared. This is where most people stopped paying attention, and where the prophecies insisted they shouldn't. After the peak moments of tension passed, a strange calm settled in. No invasion, no formal war. Commentators declared the crisis contained. Governments shifted focus elsewhere. To the casual observer, the storm had passed. But the predictions never described an explosion. They described erosion. One recurring idea appears across multiple prophetic sources, that the conflict with Iran would normalize a new standard of confrontation, a world where threats replace treaties, where escalation becomes routine, where peace isn't restored, it's postponed. And that's exactly what followed. The United States and Iran entered a pattern of shadow conflict. Naval incidents that stopped just short of engagement, cyber attacks that were never officially acknowledged, proxy clashes in third countries, deniable and fragmented, each side testing boundaries, learning how far they could push without triggering collapse. This was not peace. It was tension institutionalized. Several predictions referred to this phase as the quiet war, a condition where citizens feel safe because bombs aren't falling, but decisions are being made that permanently increase the likelihood of future catastrophe. The danger becomes background noise, normal. Trump's role in this phase is often misunderstood. He was no longer issuing daily threats. The rhetoric softened. Public attention shifted. Yet the framework he built remained intact. Maximum pressure didn't end with his term. Sanctions stayed. Distrust deepened. Red lines blurred. This aligns closely with a lesser-known prophetic warning that the most disruptive leaders don't destroy systems outright. They leave behind conditions that make stability harder for everyone else. In this view, Trump wasn't the climax. He was the catalyst. Another prediction described it as a man who walks away before the fire spreads, but after the match is lit. The meaning becomes clearer when looking at what followed his presidency. Subsequent administrations inherited a situation where de-escalation carried political risk, and escalation carried global consequences. Iran, meanwhile, adapted. Rather than confronting the United States directly, it expanded influence indirectly. Regional proxies grew bolder. Missile programs advanced quietly. Nuclear ambiguity increased, each move calibrated to avoid immediate retaliation while strengthening long-term leverage. Prophecy analysts point out that this too was anticipated. One vision spoke of Iran gaining strength in the shadows, not through conquest, but through patience. Another warned that pressure without resolution would teach endurance, not submission. This reframes the entire story. If the goal of pressure was to force compliance, it failed. If the goal was deterrence, the results were mixed. But if the unintended consequence was to normalize permanent confrontation, then the prophecies were disturbingly accurate. There's another layer often overlooked: public psychology. Repeated crises condition societies. When people are constantly told war is possible, they eventually stop reacting. Fear dulls, urgency fades. This is dangerous because it creates space for miscalculation. Leaders assume the public won't care or won't notice until it's too late. One prophecy warned explicitly about this. The people will grow tired of warnings, and that is when the warning will matter most. Think about how quickly the Soleimani strike faded from public discourse. How rapidly a moment that could have triggered regional war became just another historical footnote. That forgetting is part of the consequence, and it sets the stage for what comes next. Here's the unsettling implication raised by these predictions, that the Trump-Iran confrontation wasn't meant to end in war, but to prepare the world for one, not immediately, but psychologically, structurally, strategically, by lowering the threshold of acceptable risk, by making brinkmanship normal, by teaching leaders that standing on the edge brings leverage without immediate cost, until it doesn't. This is where interpretations diverge. Some argue the prophecies overestimate Trump's influence, that Iran tensions predate him by decades, that history, not personality, drives these cycles, and they're right, partially. But prophecy rarely focuses on origins. It focuses on accelerators, and Trump was an accelerator. He compressed timelines, intensified choices, forced confrontations into the open that had previously been managed quietly. That exposure changed how all sides operate now. The consequences are still unfolding. Every future crisis between the US and Iran now carries the memory of this period. The knowledge that escalation can happen fast. That restraint isn't guaranteed. That leadership style matters as much as military capability. And that's the most important consequence the prophecies pointed to. Not destruction, but precedent. As this block closes, one question hangs unresolved. If this phase was preparation, what exactly was it preparing for? Because according to the predictions, the most dangerous moment isn't when tensions rise. It's when everyone believes they already survived the worst. Trump and Iran prophecies never described a clean ending. No treaty, no victory parade, no moment where tension simply dissolves. Instead, they pointed towards something far more unsettling. A future shaped not by a single decision, but by habits formed under pressure. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because if the earlier phases were about escalation, restraint, and consequences, the final phase is about responsibility, about who carries the weight of choices once the spotlight moves on. Many prophecies end not with events, but with warnings. One recurring theme stands out, that the most dangerous conflicts are the ones people believe have already passed. When leaders, media, and citizens shift focus elsewhere, unresolved systems remain in place, armed, suspicious, and ready. In these predictions, Iran was never portrayed as defeated or appeased. It was portrayed as waiting for distraction, waiting for division, waiting for the moment when pressure becomes unsustainable for those applying it. And just as importantly, the prophecies warned that the United States would face a different kind of risk. Not sudden attack, but gradual loss of control over escalation. A future where decisions are inherited, not chosen. Where each new leader is constrained by the precedents left behind. This is the shadow Trump's Iran policy cast forward. Not because of one strike, not because of one speech, but because it redefined how far a president could go without triggering immediate war. That line moved, and once lines move, they rarely return to where they were. Some prophetic interpretations frame this as a test, a moment where the world learns whether power will be used to resolve tension or simply manage it until it explodes elsewhere. In this framing, Trump was neither hero nor villain. He was a signal of what happens when unpredictability becomes doctrine. Another vision described it this way: the storm will not come from the man who shouts the loudest, but from those who inherit the silence after him. That line resonates now more than ever. Because the Trump-Iran confrontation didn't end in war, many concluded it never would. That conclusion may be the greatest risk of all. History shows that frozen conflicts don't disappear. They accumulate pressure. They wait for missteps. They wait for exhaustion. And exhaustion is visible everywhere. Allies are divided. Trust in institutions is fragile. Public attention is fractured. These conditions were explicitly referenced in several predictions, not as causes, but as accelerants. One warning stated that the final trigger wouldn't look like aggression. It would look like routine, a decision justified as necessary. Familiar language, familiar threats, familiar posturing, until suddenly it isn't familiar anymore. This brings us back to the uncomfortable question at the heart of the story. Were these prophecies truly about Trump and Iran, or were they about a world learning to live on the edge and forgetting why that edge was dangerous in the first place? Trump's role may be over, but the framework remains: sanctions, distrust, military readiness, proxy pressure. None of it vanished. It simply stopped being news, and prophecy has always warned that what stops being news doesn't stop being real. The final warning in several of these predictions is remarkably consistent. The next crisis will not announce itself as unprecedented. It will feel familiar, almost boring, and that familiarity will delay reaction until options are gone. That is the loop. That is the unfinished ending. If this story feels unresolved, that's intentional. Because according to the prophecies, it is unresolved. The chapter closed, but the book didn't. And now the question shifts to you. Do you believe these predictions were genuine insight, or coincidence shaped by hindsight? Did Trump prevent war, or make the next one harder to avoid? Write your thoughts below. And if you want to understand how patterns like this repeat, how power, personality, and prediction collide across history, there's another story waiting for you next.